Next, we're going to be continuing with this whole discussion. I thought that was a great way to open everything because she sort of listed everything that we're going to be talking about today. Next, we're going to be talking a little bit about Graywater. We got Robert Stefani from the Water Conservation Division. He's a conservation program specialist. Robert?
Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Ms. Delaney, for having some Graywater conversations in the Grow Green training. I think it's pretty progressive to think about this source. So I'm going to give a Graywater overview. Typically, this presentation does a little bit of both. Talks about the regulatory environment with Graywater, but also does a little bit of installation kind of guidance. Mr. Maxwell Gaines is going to follow me. He's a professional engineer that installs these things for a living. We're going to leave some of the installation discussion up to the professionals, and I'll kind of work you at a higher level through the regulatory environment associated with Graywater and touch base a little bit on some of the installation components. So let's start off. What is Graywater? Well, actually, let's start off. Is Graywater legal? And like Ms. Gross's lead-in question, of course, I know you know what the answer is. The answer is yes. I'll follow up on that a little bit, though. Graywater's always been legal. Graywater, at a certain level, was never illegal. What happened with Graywater in the state of Texas and the city of Austin is it was unregulated. And with the unregulation, or the lack of regulation, there was some confusion. Some departments chose to view it as illegal. Some departments chose to encourage it. So you ended up with this weird kind of nexus in the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, where there really was no rule set with Graywater. In reality, people had been doing it in the rural communities as a matter of disposal, as a matter of practice. It was what everybody did. It was only when we started thinking about Graywater from a regulatory standpoint within the local communities or within these municipalities that we had to kind of think about this a little more thoroughly. Around 2006, 2007, the state realized that it was unregulated and put in place some rule sets to guide the local municipalities on Graywater use. It didn't quite absolve some of the confusion at the local level. Understanding that, our municipality in 2009 put together local rules for Graywater for the first time. It was done thoroughly and thoughtfully, but without a lot of stakeholder input. And so we actually formalized the legality of Graywater in the city of Austin around 2009. Prior to that, though, it was legal. It just wasn't addressed. We weren't seeing a lot of adoption in 2009, and pretty readily 2010, 2011, some concerned stakeholders went to council and asked for them to do something about it. What they did do was put together a Graywater working group. The Graywater working group composed of about 5, 6, 7 individuals from the community and multiple city departments, watershed protection, water utility, plumbing officials, health officials. We had everybody in the room. Went on for about a year. In the end, what happened was that group had identified about 11 impediments to the regulatory process that they felt were making Graywater implementation a little more difficult. When we got to the end of the process, what we realized was the majority of the impediments could be addressed through the regulatory process, that really there were just little tweaks that needed to be made to the code to make Graywater use a little easier. That was all done. That was all accommodated within the 2012 rule set, which is what we're using now. So a lot of the stuff that I talk about comes from this book. It's the 2012 UPC. It's our plumbing Bible here. Within the 2012 UPC, at a local level, we do local amendments. Local amendments are where we tweak the language in the plumbing code to meet special certain conditions. So a lot of the stuff that you're going to see as we run through this stuff from a regulatory perspective, especially at a local level, are results of a community stakeholder process that modified the plumbing code to address these certain local concerns. There's a little bit of history on Graywater and why we talk about Graywater the way we do. So what is Graywater? Graywater, very simply, is untreated wastewater from non-contaminated sources, non-contaminated from an organic perspective. Bathtubs, showers, lavatory, laundry sinks. One that I've just found recently are mudroom sinks, laundry room sinks. Really, those are kind of specific, but the big general kind of concept with Graywater and what Graywater is it's water that's not contaminated with organic matter. So things that would be off limits would be like your kitchen sink, because you've got food waste contaminating that source. Your toilets, obviously, are black water. Anything that's got something bad in it, kind of view it like that. That water use balance diagram on this right-hand side is kind of important. What that shows you is from a kind of a traditional view how much gray water, if you used it all, would be available? And the answer is about half of your water use. So on a daily basis, if you were to use all of the sources available to you for gray water, you could use about half of the water that you use on a daily basis. This becomes important as we get into this conversation because I think we need to realize the scale limitations of gray water at a residential level. Half of our water use. If anybody was watching Ms. Gross's presentation with some attention, you saw a specific number on a green line that showed our residential GPCD, and this is kind of what we're talking about now. Last year, our residential GPCD was 70 gallons per person per day. What does that mean? That means on average across the board, each individual in your city is using about 70 gallons of water per day. Only about half of that, if you were to utilize all of the gray water sources, would be available to you. That leaves you with about 35 gallons. It's not a lot. 35 gallons over the course of the month gets you about 1,000 gallons. Put that in scale, that's about 4 rain barrels. No, 5. Yeah, it's about 4 rain barrels. So it gives you an idea of how much volume. There is water available, but it may not be as much as you think it is. So it's not a silver bullet. I like to talk about gray water. We won't do it today, but I like to talk about gray water in conjunction with the other auxiliary waters available on source. Rainwater harvesting, condensate. The reality is if we're going to use this stuff to offset full landscape usage, you're probably going to have to use them all. Each one of these auxiliary waters can be used for independent or individual uses, but if you're really looking to offset your full yard, your full irrigation, which could come in 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 gallons a month, you're looking at multiple sources, not just gray water. It is a sustainable on-site source, as all the other auxiliary waters are. They're created locally on-site, they're used on-site, they're captured on-site. One of the benefits for the utility for gray water use, if we could get gray water use at scale, is it would reduce pressure on our wastewater system. We have wastewater treatment plants just like we have water treatment plants. These are large capital expenditures. We just went through a community conversation on building a new water treatment plant, which was built. I can only imagine what the conversation on building a new wastewater treatment plant is going to be in the future. At some point, we will have to build one. The use of gray water can delay that need considerably. And it's also, Ms. Gross had kind of touched on this, all the auxiliary waters, including gray water, are not regulated by our water use code. So when we start talking about water use restrictions, we talk about once a day, twice a week, no watering. Auxiliary waters, including gray water, offer you relief from that environment. If you want to continue to keep some type of green in your yard, if this drought continues and we get further and further into it, auxiliary waters may be one of the only sources available to you. All right, so regulatory. Where do you find this stuff? At a state level, you find it in the Texas Administrative Code, or TAC, Chapter 210. That's the water it's the wastewater regulations for the state. And at a very high level, our city code is kind of built off of that. So in order for you to do gray water in the state of Texas, it must be under 400 gallons a day, which again, remember, we've got about 3 people, 2.7 persons per household. We're doing 70 gallons per day, so that's about 210 gallons, cut it in half. You can't get 400 gallons of wastewater or gray water out of your house unless you've got a lot of people in that house. So the threshold for use is kind of irrelevant for us. But what is relevant is that it needs to be able to be diverted to the wastewater system. Now, this can be accomplished with a 3-way diverter valve or an additional standpipe, but you've got to have the ability to take the gray water and put it into the sanitary sewer if needed. When would you need to do that? Typically when your soils are saturated. What you don't want to have, because gray water is a degraded water source at a certain level, you don't want this water sitting and standing in surface pooling. You don't want it just sitting in your yard. So when the soils are saturated after a rain, you may want to divert your gray water charge to the sanitary sewer and not put it directly on your yard. When the soils dry out and the soil profiles can perform like they should, it may be a good time to turn that gray water system back over to your landscape and let the yard use it that way. Right now in the state of Texas, and we'll touch on this real briefly, tanks are required on all systems. We have a tankless system that we'll talk about real briefly, but for the most part, tanks are required on gray water systems, and they must be labeled and used appropriately. From a city level, we start to pick up on the higher level rules that the state puts down and put in some kind of specific things. We have some comments about the tank, the durability of the tank materials. We have some specific connections to the drain and sewer systems, again, labeling, color types for the tanks, and backflow protection. Backflow protection is required on all systems that are pressurized. If you keep it gravity fed and you keep it outside, we can kind of give you relief from the backflow protection. On a graywater system, if backflow regulations are triggered, which would be pressure or going back inside the building at a certain level, an RPZ would be required. RPZs come with an annual inspection. What all that means is try to keep the system's gravity if possible. If you keep it at a gravity sense, you've got a lot less regulatory burden you have to deal with. Permits. Permits are required for all graywater systems, whether it's a laundry to landscape system or a full-blown branched full distribution system. All systems are required to get permits. On the laundry to landscape system in particular, you do have what's called a homestead permit. So you could pull the permit yourself as an individual if you were going to do the work yourself. The benefit on that is you reduce the permit cost. At a bare minimum, the permit will cost you about $25 to $35. So on a laundry to landscape system, which is available for a homestead permit, you could get in and out for about $35 on the permit. The whole system should be less than $100. The permit's just like any other permit. It's a subtype of a plumbing permit, so you can go to the one-stop shop and ask for an auxiliary water permit. They'll hand it out there. We also have the auxiliary water permit online on our Special Service Division site. If you went to Austin Water and went to the Special Services site, you would find the auxiliary water permit online. It can't be submitted online quite yet, but it can be printed off and filled out. They're taking the permits at two sites. They're taking them at the one-stop shop through the traditional permit intake cycles. But they're also taking them at the Special Services Division. It's a function of the water utility. They're water quality protection specialists. They're also processing the applications at their Glen Bell sites. You've got two places to go for these, one-stop shop for kind of your front door stuff, or you can go to Special Services and they'll kind of give you some personal attention at that end. But again, permits are required for all graywater systems, and you'd be pulling the auxiliary water permit for that system. In the city of Austin, and this is one of my favorite parts of this job, we have multiple policy threads. We take a lot of stuff real seriously. We take water quality very seriously, as evident by the backflow requirements. There are situations where you will have to protect our distribution from a degraded water source. Additionally, we take, well, it's still back to water quality. We take our stream, lakes, and rivers' health very seriously in this city. And as a result of that, what you do have are some prohibited locations. There are some places in the city that we can't use graywater. And that's an effect of kind of the karst topography that we see on the west side of Austin. So you can't really see it. It's the best map I could get. That shaded area, which is basically Mopac's west, is off limits. That leaves about the eastern side of the town. And it makes sense from a geologic standpoint. What are you looking at in that shaded area? You're looking at karst topography. You're looking at kind of the hill country area. So untreated graywater is not allowed in that prohibited area. We can use it without any kind of worries on the east side of town or east of Mopac. But once we start to get to that karst, rocky kind of soil poor condition, graywater may not be the most appropriate auxiliary water use. What is that hatched out area? That's the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone. So that's prohibited. We can't put graywater in the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone. And other geologically sensitive areas is determined by the authority having jurisdiction. The authority having jurisdiction would be watershed protection at that point. And if there are some outcrops or pockets that kind of fall along that fringe area, those would be picked up on their permitting process and would be prohibited also. But mostly as a whole, it's that kind of western side of town, Mopac over. It may not seem fair, but it's back to this kind of thread that runs through this city from a policy standpoint. We have a lot of goals. We have zero waste goals. We have clean water goals. We have zero emission goals. We have all kinds of goals. And as conservation professionals, it's our jobs to weave that thread through here. We have to be cognizant of all of these policy issues, not just our own. Yes, ma'am.
It seems like, though, that where would be an issue is where it's going to feed directly into, like, the karst features. Mm-hmm. So it could be safe that if you could run your, graywater through, like, a filtration system, something like that.
And that's an interesting concept. There is discussion. When we saw the prohibition, we obviously had concerns about it too. And we've discussed with our friends at Watershed how to work ourselves through this. There has been some discussion at a certain level about the definition of gray water, and that may be where we start to look at this. What is gray water? Well, by definition, gray water is untreated water. It's untreated water from those sources. What happens if I treat it? Is it still gray water? And I don't have that answer. I mean, I have my own thoughts. This isn't the place to have that conversation. But there is kind of a tack on maybe definitionally. You know, if the concept is to protect those water sources, is there an alternate way to protect those water sources, i.e. maybe treatment? But we're not quite there yet, and we're in discussions with Watershed to kind of have that conversation. Plumbing codes come out on 3-year cycles. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, we're right up on an adoption cycle. 2012 was the last code that was adopted. 2015's code will be adopted between October of this year and early next year. So you'll see a new code set come out within the next 6 months or so, and that would be the opportunity for city staff to have the conversation to discuss some of these issues to see if we can find some relief moving forward. You've touched on a good point for sure. Setback requirements. This is also a function of kind of stream and health quality. You know, there are certain things that you don't want to put these systems next to. So you've got building structures, these traditional kind of offsets that you'll see from a building perspective. The one thing you don't see on there are stream, lakes, and rivers. The reason why is there's some uncertainty to the setbacks that would be required for that. The plumbing code is pretty stock at a 25-foot offset. Again, back to some of these policy threads and the seriousness that we take our water quality and our lake bodies and our water bodies leads us to a place where there's some variation in the stream, rivers, and lakes offsets. It can be anywhere between 50 and 250 feet. It's kind of situationally dependent. There is no straight line answer. On water bodies, my advice is be prudent about it. Think about it. You know, 250 is probably your maximum. Get 250 feet away from those bodies, and that way you're pretty good. You could potentially be closer, but you're going to have to communicate with Watershed Protection to figure out how close they're going to allow you to get these things on a case-by-case perspective. 250 is your max. I'd kind of stay 250 feet away from any water body. If you're outside of that, you're probably pretty good. But you're not going to see it stated in the setback requirements. It's going to be used as a case-by-case situation. And then again, any of these distances, including the setbacks to the lakes, rivers, and streams, can be expanded depending on situational circumstances. If it's a highly protected source or some type of direct karst feature, you may need to be farther back than the 250. That, in a nutshell, is kind of the regulatory environment. You're guided at a state level and at a local level. We've got some pretty precise rules to follow, but they have been massaged and made streamlined based on the work of a Graywater working group. One of the things the Graywater working group came up with as an impediment was the septic type design of these systems. Really what you had from a legal standpoint was graywater use, but graywater use really mimicking blackwater use. What they were really doing was saying, hey, you can use it, but you can only use it in this one fashion. And the fashion that they had was a septic tank. It was a tank that would put the water 3 to 4 feet underground on a 3 to 4 inch tube with perforations in it. What we realized is you weren't really getting any effective root zone use of that water. Basically, you were disposing of it. You weren't beneficially reusing it. You were just getting it into the subsoil, and you were hoping that it goes away. There are a lot of other beneficial uses for gray water. If you can move that water up the profile, if you can get it up into the effective root zones, you can actually begin to beneficially reuse it. And that's where you see the new code come into place, where we have multiple distributions options available that weren't available in the previous version of the code. So we've got 3 now. Laundry to landscape, we'll actually have 4 if you include that one. Laundry to landscape is kind of a standalone, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's a result of that Graywater working group's efforts. And it's really kind of a primer, a place to get your feet wet with gray water use. Kind of like, I like to look at the laundry to landscape system similar to a 50-gallon rain barrel. It's a great place to start. It's a great place to get familiar with it. It's a great place to get kind of a perceptual signal on how much water you want or you're using, but the scale will be pretty low. Branch drain is a more comprehensive system. It's where you start bringing on all of the sources available to you and then distributing them out in a traditional irrigation type structure. Gravity fed versus pressurized are just 2 of the ways that you would move the water through the system. Again, gravity fed is your easiest one, doesn't require any additional pumps, pretty cheap, and will keep you away from backflow protection requirements. Once you pressurize that system, which is needed when you start using it at scale, you've got a little more regulatory environment to deal with. Laundry to landscape. Laundry to landscape is my favorite. Laundry to landscape is something that didn't exist prior to the 2012 code cycle. And frankly, we're the only city in the state that allows this. It's a tankless system, and that's what makes it so unique. The tank was an impediment from a financial perspective. And actually, at a certain level, the tank is an impediment from a best management practices perspective. You really don't want to be storing gray water. Gray water goes septic really quickly, and the best thing to do with gray water is to get it in and get it out. Put it out on the landscape as quickly as it goes into the system. You don't want to be storing the gray water. And this is what a laundry landscape does. It's a simple design. It brings on a single source. It's very cost effective. It's tankless. It can be installed by a homeowner and does have a homeowner permit available to it. Again, that system installed should cost you with the permit less than $100. Mr. Maxwell Gaines, I think, will talk about that a little more depth, but the laundry landscape is a really cool thing that the city's allowed our citizenry to kind of engage in. Laundry landscape is only available for private 1- and 2-family dwellings, so it's not available at a commercial level. But there are other distribution methods that you can use once we get to scale. That's kind of a quick schematic of the laundry to landscape, and again, I'll let Chris kind of dig into it a little bit, but it shows you how simple these systems can be. This has got multiple mulch basins associated to this particular laundry to landscape system. But again, when you're using this, let's talk about the yields. Let's think about the yields. A washing machine, especially the new high-efficient washing machines, don't use any more than about 20 gallons a cycle. So that's 20 gallons going through that system. Again, 20 gallons is about half of a 50-gallon rain barrel. It's not that much water. It's 4 Home Depot buckets. That system's got 7 plants associated with it. So 7 divided by, you're looking at 3 gallons of water on each one of those plants through a system like that. You'll see this at the end of the presentation. One of the things that I like to do with these auxiliary waters, or I like to advise people on these auxiliary waters, is to think about your need first. Don't think about the water source. Think about what you want to do with it. And then create a system of auxiliary water to feed your need. Don't create a new need, I think is the story I'm trying to tell. We see this a lot with rainwater harvesting. We've had a very aggressive rainwater harvesting incentive for quite a while. When we go to look to quantify the rainwater harvesting program, at times we see an increase in water usage, and we ask ourselves, how does that happen? What we think is happening are people actually creating uses that didn't exist before. And so they do a graywater system, they do a rainwater harvesting system, and they're doing it out of the best intentions. But they may go start a new garden, they may go plant a new tree, they may go do something that wasn't there before through a landscape modification. And then what happens is they have to go establish the plant. They realize that the yield isn't enough to keep the plant alive. It's enough to sustain the plant, but it may not be enough to establish the plant. And so they come in with potable use to establish it, and alas, their usage increases. Use these auxiliary waters to displace what's already going on your site. Try as best as you can not to create a new use. This is a branch system. This is the more complex system. So a branch system typically is used when you're bringing on multiple sources. And when I say multiple sources, what I mean is you're bringing on the bathtub in conjunction with the washing machine, in conjunction with the lavatory sink. You're bringing in as much gray water as you possibly can. When you start getting to that yield, again, remember 70 was the gallons per capita per day last year, so you're using about 200, 250 gallons per household. You may have 125, 150 gallons available to you at a residential level on a daily basis. That yield's getting bigger. You can do something with that water. You may not be able to offset your full lawn irrigation, but you can now get to runs of shrubs. You can get to multiple plants. As the yield gets higher, your availability to use this water gets greater. Laundry to landscape, not a lot of yield. You may want to think about using that on a singular plant. If you get to a branch system, you can start looking at larger areas of your landscape. Bring on all the auxiliary waters, you can start displacing your full outdoor use. Use these things kind of bit by bit. Branch does have a larger yield, but it typically comes with a larger regulatory environment. Typically these systems are pressurized, thus they have reduced pressure zone assemblies or RPZs, which have their own set of regulations involved with them. This is kind of a quick schematic of what a branch system would look like if I had multiple sources associated to it. So I've got a bathtub, but if I had a washing machine and a lavatory sink in line with that, that would be an example of a branch system. So this is one of the big things that the plumbing code did do, and some of the relief that was offered to the city through that Graywater working group is we increased the distribution options. And what this does is allows that water to get higher up in the soil profile and allows it to be used more beneficially depending on the plant species. So end use is really important in this game. It's really important for you to understand what you want to do with this water before you start to approach a system design. Subsoil, subsurface, and mulch basins are our 3 types of distribution methods available to us. Again, mulch basin is only available to residential homes and duplexes, but we're going to address them as a distribution method. Subsoil is the old school style. Subsoil is what was allowed previously. It's basically getting rid of the water. You put it in a tank, you dispose it 6 feet underground, 3 to 6 feet underground, and you kind of get rid of it. Now, the minimum distribution on that system is 10 inches, and you can start to play with this a little bit. A subsoil system is what it sounds like. It's subsoil. It's supposed to be below the soil profile or right on that borderline of the soil profile. But there are certain species that could benefit from that level. I was thinking the other night of pecan tree. Pecan tree has a deep root system, or a deep tap root. There is some depth to that pecan tree. Something like this could feed that root. A fibrous root system like an oak tree, there may be a better distribution method available, and we'll talk about that. Think about your plants, think about the end uses, think about what you want to do with this water, and let that lead to your design instead of thinking about the design and leading it to the end use. And Chris, I hope I'm not making your job more difficult. Subsurface, this is my favorite. This is kind of the new big one on this. This is basically just drip irrigation. And this wasn't allowed in the previous code cycle. So this starts to get you to that fibrous root zone. We can start talking about turf if we have enough yield. We can talk about bedding plant material. We can talk about shrubs. We can talk about these more porous or these fibrous root systems that aren't but about 1 or 2 foot into the soil. And this is just what it looks like. It's a traditional drip irrigation system. Would require pressurization, thus an RPZ, but it allows you to start using this gray water or your auxiliary waters at a little more scale. And again, that was something that wasn't allowed before. Previously, you also weren't allowed to have single zones on these systems. So where you did have the deep distribution system, you had to have multiple branches of this thing. Now in the code, what you can do is have a single zone. So you can have a small system, and you don't have to have these complicated layouts where you've got this stuff going all over the place. You can kind of isolate it to one place. If you're using, your laundry water and your washing machine and you don't have that much yield coming out, you could run that drip in a shrub bed and basically keep the bed watered. So you could do multiple plants. You could do shrubs and bedding flowers. But again, thinking about the end uses and using the water at that end use is kind of important. Mulch basin. This is a cool one. It's only available to residential and duplexes, but this is a good one for tree canopy. And like Ms. Gross had talked about earlier, maybe we're starting to hear that people are willing to sacrifice their lawns for trees. And maybe, hypothetically, what if this drought gets really bad? And what if we can't do outdoor lawn watering? What if we want to save the trees? This may be your path. So a mulch basin is kind of what it sounds like. You just dig a trench around an established something, hopefully something established big, not something established small. Dig a trench around the established root ball, fill it up with mulch, put a mulch basin or an irrigation control valve box at the front end of that thing, and run your pipe into it. That's a mulch basin. On a laundry to landscape system, you may only have enough water to feed one mulch basin. But if you bring on multiple sources, you could do multiple mulch basins. So again, think about your end uses and then let that decide your design. Commercial gray water, won't touch on it a lot because it's probably not the right forum, but there is a lot of potential for a commercial scale use of this stuff. Commercial use is allowed to go back inside the building, so we can start using gray water for toilet flushing. We've got a project that we're kind of playing with some clients right now that would use an entire building's worth of gray water to feed their non-potable sources, and they're trying to close their loop. They're trying to bring the gray water into a tank, all of their gray water uses, and then use that tank to feed the non-potable sources in a closed loop water balance. It's kind of a cool concept and can really reduce commercial usage at scale. Indoor use right now today isn't really legal, at a residential level, but it is at a commercial, and that's an opportunity for scale. We'll talk about indoor use at a residential level here in a second. Surge tanks. Surge tanks are required by the state of Texas on all systems with the exception of the laundry to landscape system in the city of Austin. So any other system other than that very simple washing machine design is going to require a tank at this point. You can still do gravity through it. It doesn't really tell you how big the tank should be. I've seen a design with a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket and a lockable lid pass. It's a tank. And remember, the concept is, as a best management practice, storing it is not the ideal situation. You want the system designed such that it expels all of the water as soon as the water comes in. You don't want it sitting in there. So let's talk about indoor use for a second. One of the really exciting things that happened in this legislative cycle is that the city of Austin was able to actually proactively get some relief or potential relief on graywater systems from the state of Texas. And anybody that's from this city knows how difficult that actually is. Typically, we don't play with the ledge, and the ledge doesn't play with us. But on this particular situation, we actually got some local support and pushed together some bipartisan legislation through the legislature that requested TCEQ to go and look at the graywater rules. And they were requested to look at the graywater rules on two fronts. A, the tank requirement. They're going to go back in and revise or revisit the tank requirement for appropriateness. I think we've got a really good chance to get the tank requirement rescinded. And really what the language should look like is when a tank is required, because there are some situations, especially in the commercial sector, where you need a tank, where you've got so much yield coming in you can't distribute it all at one time, and you need to store it. But those systems typically come with treatment. At a residential level where we're not treating this stuff, storing isn't really the best idea. So the state's going to revisit that. More excitingly, what the state's going to go revisit is the allowance for gray water use indoors at a residential level. If we can get the gray water to be allowed to go inside, we can start displacing toilet flushing and non-potable uses just like the commercial sector. As a matter of fact, there are some plumbing-approved devices being implemented in California right now that allow you to use gray water or sink water, lavatory sink water, directly into your toilet. It's about a $250 device. It's got a small, it's basically just a small treatment system in the size of a shoebox. The lavatory sink is turned on when you wash your hands, which encourages us all to wash our hands. It goes into this tank. The tank cleans it and pumps it directly to your toilet. It's a really cool system, something that's not quite legal today, but the state is going to look at the legality of indoor water use for gray water on a non-potable level, and that's pretty exciting stuff for us. We're also really close to finishing our gray water guidance document. We've put some thought and some time into a comprehensive, local-centric gray water guidance document. It's actually in draft form right now and undergoing internal review and should be out in the next few weeks to a month or so. That'll be exciting because it'll give you kind of one place to look for all this stuff. And up until then, I've kind of been your source. So it'll take some pressure off of me. I'm always available, and you'll see this at the end, but we will have a lot of my kind of stock spiel embedded into a guidance document that should help facilitate this adoption. And then again, like I'd mentioned, 2015 coming up, we have a new plumbing code cycle, and we'll look for opportunities to tweak that plumbing code to see if we can find some more relief or more progressiveness in the plumbing code related to gray water and all the auxiliary waters. And with that, I'll leave you with some gray water resources. It's got a bunch of the contact numbers for our department, Watershed Protection. I don't think Watershed's on there, but Special Services on there, Permit Center's on there. There's also some kind of national guidance. The San Francisco Graywater Design Manual is a fantastic one and one that we kind of look for guidance. Again, and I've asterisked it and caveated it. When we look at these external sources for guidance, please be sure to check back in with your local requirements, because what you see in San Francisco isn't exactly what is legal here. Conversely, what we do isn't exactly what they do there, but they're close. The San Francisco Guidance Manual is a good one until we can replace it with our own better local document, because our document will be better. And with that, I will take any questions. And also comment that I am available as a resource to you guys and to anybody looking to do gray water, any auxiliary water systems. If you've got questions or get caught, give me a call and I'll help facilitate the conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Talking about the total elimination of the tank in residential, will that be in these
we have to wait for the state. And I suspect probably not. I suspect the state TCEQ was just requested to go look at them, and session doesn't come in for another 2 years. Typically what we see is they won't look at it for about a year and a half. And then they'll come. So the plumbing code will probably be adopted before the state makes a decision. Now, what we can always do is locally amend the plumbing code. Just because you pass it doesn't mean you can't change it. You just have to go through a formal cycle. So hypothetically, what would happen or what could happen is you end up with the same kind of rule as far as indoor or tank use today, because the state hasn't modified their rule set yet, thus you can't modify yours. But as soon as the state were to make a decision and hypothetically modify TAC or the Texas Administrative Code, our plumbing officials, and we would be on that from a tracking perspective, could very quickly modify the local amendments to our plumbing code to reflect the change at a state level. So I don't anticipate you're going to get the relief in October, because I don't anticipate TCEQ is going to get the review done by that time. Our rule set will follow their rule set.
In general, do you think it's going to change in a more user-friendly way or not much at all?
I think it's more user-friendly. I think at a certain level, because of a lot of the work that the city's done, you've got a pretty streamlined, easy process right now. What we're really doing, the hard changes have been made. We're kind of tweaking changes now. Now, a tank in an indoor, that's a pretty big change, but from a process standpoint, from a permitting, from a regulatory standpoint, we have some prohibitions that we need to work through, but it's as streamlined as I think we can get it right now.
And then my last question. For people that do adopt the most aggressive thing they can as far as using a graywater system, are they still charged on the city utility bill for the wastewater?
You, if I had a prize, would give you a prize. Nobody's ever, I don't know the answer to that. I've thought about it. We've had informal discussions about it. I think it's something that we should bring up to management and have that discussion with. I don't know. I personally haven't heard us talk about that at a higher level. That's, yeah. Correct, but Graywater, you would see the use on the charge, but it doesn't go to the system, and I think that's what we're talking about. You could see a credit situation where you have usage registered for treatment that's not occurring. It's a discussion that we've had, and I think it's a discussion that Ms. Gross may rise up through the management discussion. But I haven't heard anything formal on that, and I think you bring up a very, very, very good point, frankly, one that I haven't heard discussed publicly yet. Nice question. Yes, ma'am.
The Mulch Basin technically was approved for multifamily?
No, well, duplex. The question was, is the mulch basin available for multifamily use? And the answer is depends on how you define multifamily. It's available for duplex use only. Single family and duplex. Triplex and higher, it's not.
But I did see the word multifamily on one slide. If you meant duplex, it's not. Go back.
Forward, back, forward. Right, and I think we got it. I just need to change that. It's addressed up on this front end. Two-family dwellings. Yes, sir.
You said RPZ
On any pressurized system. Pressure is the key on the RPZ.
if it is not attached to potable water system.
Correct. Correct. And you're guarding against cross connection. Even if it's not connected, the potential for cross connection still exists. So that's why we do require RPZs on certain situations on systems that aren't directly connected to the potable system. It's based on potential. It's based on risk. And once you pressurize the system, it becomes a little more dangerous as far as the ability of that pressure to seed back inside the house. Gravity, because of gravity, because of that lower pressure and because of the high pressure of the potable water system, if there was a cross connection, you would take the potable and interject it to the the non-potable system, which isn't good, but it's not going to kill you. Once you pressurize that system, depending on how high your local pressure is, you could actually find a situation where the auxiliary water is pressure than your domestic pressure, which in case if there was a cross connection, you would then be introducing the auxiliary water into the potable system, and that's what you're guarding against. Yes, ma'am. Any?
Another question about multi-field. Is the definition, I know that you talked a little bit about graywater uses for commercial, is the definition of commercial by end use going from?
The question is commercial defined by end use or plumbing code?
Yeah.
It's probably more a function of billing code. Really, if you get stuck, it's really the intent, is it a commercial facility? But we look at those sectors based on billing codes, and hopefully you're being billed commercial rates if you're a commercial sector. Yes, sir.
Soaps and detergents, are they a consideration?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Mr. Maxwell Gaines is going to touch a little more about that on operational system. But yeah, you know, the surfactants in the soap, probably not the best things in there. There are soaps that are made for graywater use. Dr. Bronner's got one. There are some specific low phosphorus yields, low surfactant yields, or surfactant, or whatever that word is. But again, think about scale. If you're using a whole bunch of it, you know, you may want to be aware of it. If you're not doing a bunch, if you're doing a laundry to landscape and it's 8 gallons, you know, it's a discretionary thing. The more you're using, the more that becomes a load. One of the best management practices on graywater is turning the soil over, because this kind of comes up, and it came up with the prohibitions. You know, the idea with graywater is that you utilize the soil profile to clean that water source out. And that's why the prohibition exists on the west side of town, is those soil profiles traditionally get smaller and smaller. One of the best management practices on graywater use is to turn the soil over every so often. That if you literally just take the soil, turn it upside down, aerate it somewhat, and expose it to the sun, you're going to break down a lot of that binding. So the soil profile is basically the filter for graywater, and the more soil you've got, the cleaner that water is by the time it percolates down. If you're using this over decades, you can build up some salts, some phosphoruses in there that can be kind of potentially bad from a plant health perspective, not from a human health and safety perspective. And the remedy to that is to turn that soil over every 5-10 years, add some new fresh compost in there, and just keep that soil churned up. Yes, ma'am. So the tank doesn't come, the state requirements with the tanks don't have a specific size associated with it. Traditionally, you use a tank. Traditionally, a tank is called a surge tank, and it's used for what it sounds like. It's used to accommodate additional surge that the distribution system can't accommodate. The way the state's using a tank is really as a cleaning portal, is the way it's been described to me. They know that you're not supposed to store this stuff, but the regulator said you need a place to clean all the gunk out. My response was we can do that with a clean out. We don't necessarily need a larger built tank. What the state does is say it must be built of a durable material. It doesn't tell you what size it has to be. It doesn't necessarily tell you what it has to look like. It's got some design parameters. It's got to have an overflow. It's got to have the ability to divert the flow to the sanitary sewer. It's got some ins and outs, but the reality is it's just a plastic tank that's got a couple pipes coming in and a couple pipes coming out, and you really, no filter. They use it, or they view it as a place to go clean out the lint and debris that would come out of a laundry to landscape system. But I think there are other ways to do that without the tank. My concern with the tank is the tank gets clogged, and now you're actually storing this stuff. And if we're not paying attention, 2-3 days, graywater can get pretty bad pretty quick. You really want that on the landscape as quick as possible. And if you don't want to put it on the landscape, you want to divert it back to the sanitary sewer, in my opinion. We good? Everybody good? All right. Thank you, guys.
All right, guys, we're going to take a little break right now, 15-minute break. I'll be back at, 10:40?